The transition in gaming from 2D to 3D was an exciting time, but not for everybody. The transition didn't go well for certain games and certain gamers who weren't excited about seeing their beloved 2D sprites turn into, well, the future, I guess. Sometimes change isn't an upgrade. Am I the only one who cried as a kid when the beast turned human? I thought he died and turned into this. Would have cried less had he stopped at dying. Of course, not all game series made the transition. Some only ever came back as 2D games, some never came back at all. Naturally, of the series that did make the transition, the outcomes varied as well, ranging anywhere from alright, awesome in any dimension to honestly, my hopes weren't that high. But for this video, I'm going to be focusing on the games that were really awesome in 2D, ventured into the 3D space, and if it were up to me, 2D would still be the focus. And yes, I do understand that because we're a bunch of retro gamers, praising 2D games is kind of like fishing with dynamite since we tend to love them. After carefully considering various game series, your list might just look like this. I can promise that mine doesn't, but with that, the first series I'd like to bring up is Sonic the Hedgehog. And if there was ever a series that's had multiple chances to make a good 3D game, this is it. A lot of series will try once, it goes horribly, and then they flee from it like the scene of a crime. 3D Sonic is like going back to the scene of a crime and assaulting the people investigating it. That's how some people felt playing 06. Now, don't get me wrong, 3D Sonic isn't all bad and does have its fans, with so many of them and how topical they can be. It can be fun to hear which games people say are their favorites and why. Even myself, I've always loved Sonic Adventure 2 and Generations, but I just kind of love them, whereas 2D Sonic games I really love. 3D Sonic, 2D Sonic, 3D Sonic. When my wife catches me like this, she knows I'm playing 2D Sonic. And I think it's no coincidence that the Sonic game that's gotten arguably the most praise in the last 20 years is the one that's most faithful to the original games on the Genesis, Sonic Mania. Thank goodness for this game, am I right? Because we can't just play the original trilogy over and over. Actually, sure we can. They're still fun, and here's to another few decades worth of playing them. To me, the big thing that 2D Sonic games have over 3D Sonic games is the way level design works in conjunction with the speed of the game. Basically, making a platformer with the kind of speed that Sonic has is really tricky to do, and working in 2D rather than 3D makes it not quite as complicated by removing some of the variables. Because when you introduce speed, things have a higher chance of going wrong. How do you make a game where you can go fast but still feel in control? Besides, racing games. But for platformers, it's tough to do. You're not just moving on a clear, unobstructed path. However, when you play 2D Sonic games, you at least have the benefit of moving on a fixed plane, removing a lot of the opportunity to randomly careen out of control. Not to mention, make the camera's job a lot easier. For the next series, we have Earthworm Jim. Probably not going to be getting a lot of people pushing back on this one. Earthworm Jim 3D is mostly agreed upon as mediocre at best, with even some fans of mediocrity saying, we don't want this. If you're looking to play a 3D platformer, there's just a lot of better options. However, the 2D Earthworm Jim games do a much better job at sticking out, even while facing pretty stiff competition from so many great 2D platformers released during that era. While the game can still do a lot of the weird stuff in 3D that people loved in the 2D games, a lot of the game's charm comes from the hand-drawn art, in addition to the quirky animation. And with that being one of the biggest strengths of the game, it makes absolutely no logical sense to move away from this in favor of 3D polygons with less personality, except that the developers felt pressure to because that's the direction the industry was moving. But come on, devs, if your friend jumped off a bridge, would you do that too? Earthworm Jim 3D would, and playing the game might make you want to too. But don't, just play the 2D games instead. I tell you though, Earthworm Jim really makes me wonder how many series could have had more 2D masterpieces had the industry not stigmatized 2D games the way they did. It's okay though, it's not like I let it get to me or anything, and luckily not all hope is lost, as we still got some great 2D games even once 3D was starting to trend, with Symphony of the Night being a 2D banger that we could really hang our hats on, and what many would consider the better game compared to the 3D entries that popped up on the N64 that generation. To be fair, some of the later 3D Castlevania games do have their fans, but it's hard to argue against the 2D games being superior. Some of the quintessential action platformers when looking at gaming's history. Being a retro gamer without Castlevania is like eating without a functioning mouth. Luckily, the series enjoyed a nice run of 2D games on handheld consoles as well, thanks to the formula set by Symphony of the Night, which many call Metroidvania, and others call also Metroidvania, but with an eye roll. As a matter of fact, typically the debate amongst Castlevania games is between Metroidvania-style 2D games and the more classic Castlevania games, sometimes called Classicvania games, again with a high potential for eye rolling, kind of like some of the eye rolling you'll see for the 3D Castlevania games. I've always felt that in order to have a series transition well to 3D, you need to have a very inspired idea for how to make that leap. Otherwise, what's the point? Not everyone prefers Mario 64 over the older 2D games, but at least Mario 64 has a reason for being in 3D. It plays completely differently and offers a new experience. A lot of times, 3D games that transitioned from 2D just come across as sort of generic, uninspired, not really adding anything that exciting, on top of not doing the things the original games did really well as they did them. The foundation of a good Castlevania game is tight, concise action platforming, which works best in the 2D format. All that said, there is one series that I feel has some really good, inspired 3D games, but I still like the 2D games more. And with that, I'd like to introduce my most controversial choice for this video, Metroid. Right off the bat, I'll still say the Metroid Prime games are probably 10 out of 10 games. I just think the 2D games are 11 out of 10 games. Wait a second, 11 out of 10 is mathematically impossible, and that might bother some people. Well, can we ignore them? Yeah, let's do that. Now, right away, I know what some people might think. It's just a nostalgia thing that I'm choosing 2D over 3D Metroid. But nope. Never played a 2D Metroid game until I was in my 20s, whereas I played and loved Metroid Prime as a young teenager. I mean, I was all about the GameCube back then. You can bet I was hyped for and loved Metroid Prime. I have a GameCube stool, for gosh sakes. How many people own a GameCube stool but prefer 2D Metroid? Probably not many. I figured it would be a good way to make a friend at some point, so I got a t-shirt I can wear. But the main reason I prefer 2D Metroid, besides, enjoying it more, actually has a little more to do with the difficulty. In Metroid Prime, there's too much space to avoid getting hit by projectiles. I felt like I spent a lot of time watching shots come in from far away, with plenty of time to dodge to the side. In 2D Metroid games, you're in much tighter quarters and you have to be more precise to avoid getting hit. Might seem like a small thing, but for me it makes a huge difference in how the moment-to-moment gameplay feels. For the next series that I'll be talking about, I've chosen Mega Man, which, like Metroid, has some much-loved 3D games in the series, but the 3D Mega Man games offer a drastically different experience, almost to the point it seems weird to even be comparing them to the 2D games. But they do use the Mega Man IP, and I've certainly made other comparisons that surprise people, even if they shouldn't. So, here we are. Like some of the other series I've chosen, Mega Man is a foundational game series when it comes to 2D gaming. Choosing the stages by which boss you want to face next, receiving their weapon when you defeat them, and then trying to figure out which boss has a weakness to that weapon, just classic. And in theory, these aspects could all work well in a 3D game, but in theory, I could fall asleep without eating banana pancakes before I go to bed. Doesn't mean it's actually happened. The trouble is that it's hard to execute all of the intricate, clever action platforming that the 2D Mega Man games have in 3D, so might as well just stick to 2D. By the way, I'm counting the games sometimes described as 2.5D or 3D but played on a 2D plane as 2D games for the purpose of this video, in case you were wondering. But with that relieved, here's something new to wonder about. What's going on here? Rounding out the argument for 2D Mega Man games is the sheer abundance of them. Goodness gracious. The entire regular Mega Man series, the entire Mega Man X series, the entire Zero series. Would you believe there's hardcore fans who have actually completed all of them? I would if it weren't for X7, but there you have it, the 5 series that I feel are at their best in 2D. Something I realized when choosing which series I wanted to talk about for this video is that a lot of series never left 2D, didn't even bother to try 3D. For the most part, I think we can be thankful for that. Oftentimes, it's better to just come up with a brand new concept and characters and build a 3D game around that, rather than trying to force something into 3D. The world could have survived without Earthworm Jim 3D, and more shockingly, survived with it. That said, I would love to know which series you felt were at their best in 2D. And remember, that doesn't necessarily mean you think the 3D counterparts are total garbage, just that you prefer the 2D entries. You can love something while still just liking something else. So with that, leave a comment down below, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah, and he's talking about video games. He's